Okay, so I want to take you back to the beginning of the meeting, where mention was made by Professor Mendelsohn of budgets and the importance of budgets. And essentially, you've been looking at sectoral cost-benefit analysis and economic analysis of projects within sectors. But I want to take you back to the overall budget and how you can understand climate change within your budget process, and introduce a tool that UNDP has, along with some other development partners, including the World Bank, been pioneering, called Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Reviews. And I'm going to give a very short presentation, giving some of the key findings that have emerged, and then I'm going to invite a few countries that are represented here who've actually had experience of this methodology to share their views, which I think will be very interesting for you to see how it's helped those governments. So I'm in this presentation, I'm borrowing some slides from a Filipino colleague from the Climate Change Commission, which is represented here, where he represents the whole issue of getting climate change into the budget process as a planning challenge. So the challenge is how to get the money flowing through the budget where it's needed, and linking the policies, the institutions and the expenditures, and for that you can use this tool of the CPIR, which I'm going to present. And we've, under CPIRs by UNDP and in some cases the World Bank, have been undertaken in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Nepal, Morocco, Philippines, Samoa, Thailand and Vietnam. So a growing number of countries have used this tool in the region, and we would invite other countries who are interested to also consider using it. So the methodology is essentially to set up a cross-governmental steering committee, often led by finance and planning ministries, to try to develop this. The public expenditure review methodology, which those of you from finance will be familiar with, it's a World Bank expenditure has been spent. In this case, we're applying it to climate-related expenditure, and to look at the quantity and quality of that climate expenditure, to review the whole budget, and it then requires an expert assessment of what is climate relevant. Obviously, the issue of what is climate-related expenditure is going to be one that people may have different views about, which is why it's important to have a cross-departmental discussion around. So you can bring in the Water Ministry, the Agriculture Ministry, the Environment Ministry and others to get their expert views, supported by, this process has been supported by international and national consultants who help undertake the review. And then it results ultimately in an action plan for implementation. So, as I said, a number of these reviews have been undertaken. So what are some of the recommendations that have been coming out? One of the most obvious recommendations on the policy and institution side is the importance of linking budgets to climate policy. I mean, Bishwa presented that long list of different climate strategies in different countries, NAPAs and climate policies and so on. I mean, often the problem is, as you know in your own country, those climate policies and strategies are not linked with the budget process. So there are a whole lot of recommendations there, a list of prioritised projects, but they're not being funded by either international or domestic. So through the budget processes, many of your countries have performance measures. Ministries are assessed on the basis of their performance with certain indicators or certain achievements. But climate is not one of the indicators that they're assessed by. So if you can include climate-related targets, then it can be included and mainstreamed into the budget process. There's also a lack of link between budgets and the climate strategies themselves may not be prioritised and costed. So you may have environmental action plans which have different climate projects, but they don't have a budget against them. There's no idea of how much these things are going to cost and And in a sense, that's what you've been discussing here, trying to get those cost-benefit figures so that you can persuade the Ministry of Finance to include it in the budget process. Then it's important to have these kind of processes, the whole issue of climate expenditure and integrating these climate-related projects into the budget. You need to have coordination with the Finance and Planning Ministry, with technical inputs by the Environment Ministry. I mean, in the past, this agenda was led by the Environment Ministry, which is maybe as it should have been some time ago. But as this has become more politically high profile, as it becomes a whole of government agenda, you need to shift to more leadership by finance and planning with technical inputs. I mean, crucially, the Environment Ministry still has an important and key role to play in terms of scientific analysis, data, negotiations and technical input that you need to have in terms of the budget coordination and planning function led by the Finance and Planning Ministry. One of the things you've been looking at over the last couple of days is making sure that your large development projects are made climate resilient. It's not just about having a series of 5 or 10 standalone climate projects. You need to make sure that the whole portfolio of development projects is climate resilient in the infrastructure sector, in the agriculture sector, in the energy sector. You need to think about climate change. So it's not just about having separate climate projects, but looking at the whole portfolio of all the large development projects and how climate mitigation and adaptation can be included into those. Another thing that has come out of this analysis is that local government is key. In many cases in your countries, I mean, take the example of Pakistan, which has quite a dramatic decentralization program. A lot of expenditure is being made by local government. That includes increasingly climate-related expenditure. So it's not just about international negotiations, about discussions in capital city, but you need to make sure that the money flows down to local governments, and local governments are in the driving seat about deciding how to include climate into their expenditure, into their block grants, into their funding streams. Another key area is that in many countries, I mean, Bangladesh is a prime example, there's quite sophisticated institutions, policies, financing mechanisms around disaster. And that whole apparatus has to be used more strategically in terms of linking up with climate change. There's no point creating parallel systems of disaster management and disaster planning and disaster financing with climate change, climate management and climate finance. So you need to bring those institutional channels together so that you can bring the new learning of climate change into the existing disaster management institutions. In terms of the expenditures, and we'll hear from the countries in a minute, but some of the broad things that have emerged is that the budget is a key process. It's not just about having parallel national climate trust funds or separate climate projects. You need to integrate this into the budget process. And in fact, what's interesting is that in many cases, more money than people realize is already being spent by governments. When you take a broad definition of climate change, you include disaster management, you include climate adaptation in agriculture, when you include climate proofing of infrastructure, and you include all the expenditure going on. In fact, there's quite a lot already going on. I mean, in the case of Bangladesh, which we'll hear from in a minute, they found that 75% of the expenditure is actually domestically financed. They're spending $1 billion of their own, of funds each year on climate change in the broadest sense, and 75% is domestically financed. So there's quite large amounts of money already being spent on this sector. So that it's important when you negotiate with donors, when you discuss climate change, you think of integrating these programs and projects into the budget process. Another thing that's emerged, and this relates to some of the discussions here, is that in many cases there's been a focus on a few key sectors. In the case of Bangladesh and Nepal, the bulk of the expenditure has been through the local government, through those channels. In the case of Cambodia and Samoa, there's been a lot of expenditure in terms of transport through rural roads and climate proofing those. In the case of Thailand, it was found that, as you would expect with the flooding here, a lot of climate-related expenditure is linked to irrigation and water management. So often there's a sectoral focus of the climate-related expenditure. And finally, an obvious point is that adaptation has been more of a priority than mitigation. And particularly when you look at the domestic expenditure, it's going primarily on adaptation rather than mitigation. Final points. While climate funds are important, our assessment coming out of these expenditure reviews is at the moment there's been too much focus on standalone climate funds. There's been a lot of attention, controversy in some cases in negotiations about these climate funds, who should lead them, which donor, which ministry. There's been a lot of debate which has taken time and attention in different countries about these climate funds. But in fact, they're often less than 5% of the total climate-related expenditure. If you look at the expenditure by local government, in terms of social protection, often they're much larger. We found in Bangladesh, for example, that the government spend a huge amount of money on social protection in terms of assisting poor people with different welfare schemes. And that in many cases, increasingly, those funds were going to people who are living in climate vulnerable areas and who are increasingly being impacted by climate change. So there was a growing link between social protection expenditure and climate change. But that issue was not receiving very much attention either by government or by donors because there was so much focus on these climate change funds. So you need to broaden out and be more strategic in terms of where expenditure is happening and where the really large, important aspects of climate-related expenditure are, and focus on those instead. We've also found that that public financial management is key. If you're going to attract increasing financial flows, particularly with the Green Climate Fund, many of you will be aware that Korea has now won the competition to have it hosted in Korea, so hopefully the funds will start to flow soon. If you're going to attract these funds, it's important to have public financial management systems so you can say to donors, we don't want hundreds of separate projects, we want to have them integrated in our sectors, in our budget, and we have the fiduciary standards to be able to do this. And so that's an important investment for you to make, is to strengthen your public financial management systems. And then an increasing number of countries, and we'll hear from Nepal about this in a minute, are following up their CPIRs by institutionalizing a system to track public climate expenditures in their budget process. But at the moment, the focus has been on tracking positive expenditures. If you looked at Vishwa's final slide, where he talked about something like subsidizing coal and energy, many countries subsidize coal and energy. Now that's, and if you think about it, a negative expenditure. It's not good for reducing emissions. So it's important not just to think about tracking the positive expenditures on reducing climate change, but also to try and reducing some of the negative expenditures and to include that as well. So to conclude, I can share with you there's a website where we have a lot more information about climate public expenditures and institutional reviews. It has focused on the importance of the budget process led by the finance and planning ministries. It's tried to highlight the role of some areas which haven't received enough attention, local government, social protection and infrastructure, and the linkage with climate expenditures. And it's important to develop climate budget systems which look at positive expenditures as well as negative expenditures. But maybe in the discussion I can invite colleagues from Nepal, Bangladesh and Philippines, who have experience of this tool, to share some more examples from their country. Thank you very much.